There is a trail in the southwest mountains that locals pretend is just another hiking route, even though nobody walks it for fun. The farther you go, the more the air seems to thicken, as if the forest is holding its breath. People who live near the trail do not argue about what happened there, they just tell you to turn around before sunset. At the end of that trail sits a village that has been empty longer than most families can remember. The houses are built from dark wood, and the roofs sag inward like tired shoulders, as if the place has been slowly collapsing into itself. Even in daylight it feels wrong, not dramatic, just quietly out of place like a bruise hidden under a sleeve. The village has a name, but you rarely hear it said in a normal voice. Some call it Black Hollow because it sits in a dip between ridges where fog gathers and refuses to leave. Others say the name came later, after people realized the village was not abandoned, it was sealed. The story most people repeat is simple enough to sound like a rumor. A sickness came through more than a century ago, and in one night the entire village died, every last person. The bodies were buried in a hurry, and stone markers were placed on doors and paths, carved with symbols that looked more like warnings than decorations. What those stories leave out is the part that makes the village feel heavy. Nobody ever explains why the burials were rushed, why the seals were placed so carefully, and why the road was left to disappear under weeds. When a whole place is hidden that fast, it usually means the living are afraid of what the dead might make them admit. Then the world changed and fear started competing with attention. People stopped getting quiet when they heard old warnings, they started asking for proof. And if proof could be filmed, then proof could be posted, clipped, shared, and turned into a channel that grew overnight. That was how a group of livestream explorers decided to go there. They were not criminals or cult members, they were just good at being bold in front of a camera. They called what they did urban exploration, but the truth was they sold the feeling of trespassing into places the rest of the world would avoid. They announced the trip days in advance, teasing the location without saying it outright. Viewers gathered early, watching the countdown, sending tips and messages that sounded like encouragement but felt more like pressure. The group promised midnight, promised real fear, promised something nobody else had captured. They brought equipment like they were filming a small production. Cameras, drones, thermal sensors, portable lights, and enough batteries to keep the stream alive for hours. They also brought cheap props, talismans bought at roadside markets, and little tricks meant to make the audience jump without ever leaving their couches. There is a strange kind of power in a crowd that cannot be seen. When thousands of people watch at once, the attention feels physical, like a hand on your back. It pushes you to keep going, even when your instincts start whispering that you have already gone too far. The trail up to Black Hollow looked ordinary at first, a thin cut through trees and stone. The wind moved the branches, and the ground was damp in a way that made every footstep quiet. The deeper they went, the less the forest sounded like a forest, and the more it sounded like empty room tone. By the time they reached the first leaning gate, the chat was moving too fast to read. People joked about ghosts, dared the group to walk faster, told them to pan the camera wider, asked for close-ups of anything that looked like movement. The explorers laughed and played along because laughing was part of the product. The moment they stepped through the gate, the temperature dropped in a way their sensors could not explain. It was not a cold breeze, it was a cold presence, like the air had been stored underground and finally released. The camera shook slightly, and the audio picked up a faint hiss that sounded like distance, even though the microphone was close. The lead streamer kept talking, filling space the way performers do when silence starts feeling dangerous. He made jokes about the village being a set, about locals being superstitious, about the chat being too easily impressed. Behind him the houses stood still, doors shut, windows dark, as if the village had not decided whether it was awake. Then, in the corner of the frame, a figure appeared. It wore gray cloth that blended into the fog, and it stood too still to be human. The strangest part was not the figure itself, it was that nobody in the group reacted, like the thing was invisible to their eyes but not to the lens. The chat exploded, and for a few seconds the comments were more frightened than playful. People swore there was someone standing behind the group, people argued about whether the figure had feet, people begged the camera to turn back. The group laughed harder, not because they were confident, but because fear in the audience meant the stream was working. They walked deeper into the village, stepping over wet stones and rotting boards. The fog thickened, swallowing the beam of their flashlights so the light looked shorter than it should have. The wind began to sound like soft speech, not clear words, just the shape of voices too close to ignore. One of the streamers, a woman who usually kept the energy upbeat, stopped near a wall covered in moss. She lifted a hand and pointed at a narrow crack in the stone, saying she thought something had looked out. When the camera swung toward it, there was nothing but darkness inside the crack, like an eye that had blinked shut. The group kept moving because stopping did not fit the plan. The audience kept pushing because watching other people risk themselves is easier than risking anything alone. And somewhere between those two forces, the village seemed to loosen, as if the attention had given it permission. At the center of Black Hollow was a small square, and in that square stood a stone pillar taller than a person and wider than a tree trunk. Its surface was carved with symbols that looked old enough to belong to a language nobody spoke anymore. In the grooves of the carvings was a dark red stain that did not reflect light like paint. The lead streamer leaned in and tapped it, smiling like he was testing a movie prop. Another streamer took out a tool and struck the stone once, just hard enough to make a point for the audience. The sound was dry and sharp, and the crack that formed ran straight down the pillar like a deliberate cut. All of their lights flickered at once, and the stream went dark for a moment. When the image returned, the pillar had split wider, and black smoke poured out in a slow, thick ribbon. The smell hit them even through the screen, not because a camera can carry scent, but because their reactions made it obvious, like rotten earth mixed with something that should have stayed sealed. A thin sound rose beneath the audio, like a newborn crying from far away. It was not loud, it was worse than loud because it had no urgency, only persistence. The camera drifted toward the crack, and for a brief second a red, wet-looking eye opened inside the gap, watching the lens with patient recognition. You could feel the mood shift even through the performance. The streamers still tried to laugh it off, but their voices were tighter now, their jokes landing wrong. They told the chat it was probably a prank, probably someone messing with them, even as their hands kept shaking in the light. They decided to shelter in a large wooden house near the square. They locked the door, blocked windows with furniture, and set up cameras inside like they were turning fear into a set piece. The chat loved it because confinement makes tension easy to sell, and the donation counter kept climbing. Inside the house, shadows stretched across the walls in a way that did not match the angles of their lights. The air felt damp and close, like the room had been sealed for years and resented being opened. The group ate snacks with forced calm, pretending the shaking in their fingers was part of the show. Near midnight, a knock came from the front door. It was 3 taps, evenly spaced, not aggressive, almost polite. The lead streamer froze, then smiled too quickly, telling the audience it was probably the wood settling, even though everyone could tell the sound had intention. 3 more knocks followed, louder this time, as if whoever was outside had decided waiting was no longer necessary. One streamer leaned toward the door, pressing her ear to the boards. Her face changed in a way that was hard to describe, not fear exactly, but the blank expression of someone listening to something that should not exist. The audio picked up a small voice, thin and close, asking to be let in because it was cold. The words were not dramatic, and that made them worse because they sounded practiced, like something repeating a memory. The chat filled with warnings, but warnings are easy to type when you are safe. Someone cracked the door open only an inch. Outside there was nothing but fog in the empty yard, no child, no footsteps, no movement. On the inside of the door, though, a black handprint appeared, long-fingered and wet-looking, as if soot had been pressed into the grain. Then the knocking moved, not around the house like a person walking, but instantly, as if the sound had simply relocated. It came from the back door now, 3 taps again, steady and patient. The group argued in nervous half-sentences, trying to decide whether to treat it like content or like danger. A streamer named Quinn, the one who always acted fearless, grabbed a camera and headed for the back. He told the audience he was going to check it out, his voice loud enough to hide how thin it had become. When he opened the back door, the fog outside looked thicker, as if it had piled up against the house. He stepped into the yard, sweeping the camera across weeds and stones. For a moment the feed glitched, and when it stabilized, a tall, narrow shadow stood just behind him, close enough to touch. The shadow had arms that looked too long, and it leaned toward him with the slow certainty of something that had waited a very long time. The audience screamed in comments, but Quinn did not react. He turned slightly as if hearing something whispered into his ear, and his posture changed, shoulders lowering, head tilting in a way that looked borrowed. Then he began walking back toward the house with an unsteady gait, like someone learning how to move in a body that was not theirs. At the window, his hand pressed against the glass, and the skin looked darkened, smeared, almost burned. His face drifted into the frame, and the distortion of the camera made it seem longer, as if his features were being stretched. His eyes looked pale and unfocused, like the color had been washed away. Inside, the others screamed and shoved furniture against the window. The audio picked up a rasping breath that did not belong to any of them, steady and wet, close to the microphone. Beneath it, a child's laugh surfaced, soft and pleased, like someone watching a door finally open. The stream cut out a second later. The screen went black for tens of thousands of viewers, and then a single line of red text flashed briefly before disappearing. The chat replayed it in screenshots afterward, over and over, the same words posted with shaking emojis and arguments about whether it was edited. The message said the seal was broken. 2 days later, clips from the stream spread everywhere. People slowed down frames, circled shadows, made reaction videos, and argued about special effects. But the families of the missing streamers did not argue, they simply waited for phone calls that never came. Quinn's mother went to the police, then to private search groups, then to anyone who claimed they understood the old stories. When you are desperate, you stop caring how you look, you just keep moving toward anyone who might help. That is how she ended up at a small house outside a larger city, knocking on a door like she had knocked on 1,000 doors already. The woman who answered was young, quiet, and tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. Her name was Mara, and she lived alone, working small jobs that kept her out of public view. People in certain circles said she had a gift, not the kind that made you famous but the kind that made you cautious. Mara watched the last saved clip on the mother's phone. She did not gasp, she did not flinch, she simply narrowed her eyes the way someone does when they recognize a pattern. She told the mother that money was not the problem, because what had been opened was not a private haunting, it was a public wound. Before leaving, Mara contacted someone she did not like but trusted to be useful. His name was Adrian, a self-styled investigator who had built a career around explaining the unexplained. He was charming on camera, polished in interviews, and he loved being seen as the one who could walk into darkness and come back with answers. Mara met Adrian in a quiet place where nobody would recognize them. He arrived with the confident stride of someone who believes in his own role, but his eyes sharpened when he saw the footage. He tried to make a joke, then stopped because even he could feel there was nothing playful about what they were looking at. A third person joined them, a man named Noah, the only member of the streaming group who had made it home. He looked like someone who had been aging at double speed since the night in Black Hollow. His hands trembled as he unlocked his phone, and his voice sounded strained, like he had been holding back words for days. Noah showed them a private recording he had kept, a clip that never made it to the public stream. In it, you could see Quinn pulled backward into fog by something that looked more like absence than a body. There was no dramatic scream, just a sudden cut of breath, like the air had been stolen. Noah said he could not stop thinking that the others were still there. He did not speak like a hero asking for a rescue mission, he spoke like someone confessing guilt for having survived. Mara listened without comforting him because she knew comfort can be another kind of lie. They left before dawn, driving toward the mountains with a silence that felt like agreement. Adrian tried to fill the quiet with planning, listing tools and contingencies, but his voice kept fading. Noah stared out the window like he expected the fog to appear on the road ahead and swallow the car. The trail looked smaller in daylight than it did on video. It wound between trees that stood too close together, and the air smelled damp even when the sun was out. Mara walked with her hand brushing tree trunks, feeling something in the bark that made her jaw tighten. When they reached the village gate, the temperature dropped again just as it had on the stream. Noah's camera turned on by itself, the screen flickering with static like it was catching a signal that did not belong to modern equipment. For a moment, a gray figure stood between houses, then vanished as if it had never existed. Mara lit a small strip of paper and held it in her palm, and the flame burned an unnatural color, pale and cold. The light revealed what the stream had never shown clearly, dozens of faces pressed behind windows, not moving, not blinking, just watching. Adrian stared too long, then looked away as if he understood that eye contact was not a harmless act here. They moved toward the largest building near the center of the village. The door gave way easily and a wave of sour, burned odor rolled out like a stored breath. Inside were rows of clay jars, lined up neatly as if someone had organized them with care. Each jar was sealed with dried clay and marked with the same red-stained symbols. Adrian's confidence cracked a little as he walked between them, because neatness in a place like this is never comforting. One jar in the corner trembled, then toppled, shattering against the floor. Ash spilled out, black and heavy, mixed with small bones that looked too human to ignore. The ash moved strangely, as if stirred by wind inside the room, gathering into a vague upright shape that suggested a person without ever forming a face. Noah stepped backward, his breath turning sharp, because he recognized the feeling of being watched without seeing eyes. As other jars began to rattle, the room filled with a clicking sound, like teeth tapping together in the dark. Mara placed a small mirror on a table, and the reflection it threw across the wall did not match the three of them. Their shadows were there, but so were others, longer, thinner, hanging at angles that made the skin on Noah's arms rise. Mara warned them not to turn quickly, not to stare into the wrong corner, not to give the shapes what they wanted. Adrian threw a marked strip of paper toward the wall, and the air flashed, forcing the extra shadows to recoil. For a second the room felt lighter, then every flashlight died at once, leaving only breathing and the soft scrape of something moving. Noah whispered that something was touching his shoulder. Mara relit the flame in her palm, and in the cold light they saw a headless shape standing behind him, both hands resting on Noah like a claim. Mara moved quickly, pressing the flame forward, and the shape dissolved into smoke, but the pressure it left behind did not fade. They left the jar room and headed back into the square because staying indoors felt like surrender. The fog had thickened again and the stone pillar stood split, still bleeding that dark smoke. On the far side of the square, a tree creaked like a hinge, slow and rhythmic. A rope hung from a high branch, swaying in the wind. There was no body, but a shadow shaped like a hanging person clung to the tree trunk, legs twitching slightly as if still remembering how to kick. The shadow's head tilted, and for a moment it looked like it was smiling, not with joy but with certainty. Mara found a brittle sheet of paper in her coat pocket, something she had pulled from the jar room without thinking. The handwriting was old, rushed, and uneven, describing a plague, then describing a remedy that sounded like desperation. It said the sickness was not just sickness, it was a debt, and the only way to live was to feed something that lived beneath the village. Adrian read the lines twice, slower the second time. He said the village leader had made a deal, not with a spirit of mercy, but with something that accepted blood like payment. The villagers did not simply die, they were used, their bodies burned, their remains sealed, their souls bound like laborers who never clocked out. Mara said the seals were not there to protect the living. The seals were there to protect the story, to keep anyone from digging into what the villagers did to each other when fear took control. A village can survive a plague, but it does not survive the choices people make when they decide some lives are worth less than others. They returned to the pillar, and Mara saw lines beneath the ground, faint patterns that pulsed like veins. The whole village was built on a kind of containment, a network designed to hold something down by using the village itself as the lock. Adrian admitted that whoever created it knew exactly what they were doing, and whoever agreed to it had accepted a collective sin. Then the patterns began to fail. Black smoke flowed out of the cracked pillar and traced along the underground lines like liquid finding a path, and wherever it touched, the pulsing light dimmed. It was not random, it looked deliberate, as if something inside the system was shutting doors from within. Noah pointed into the fog, and they saw a figure moving with slow authority. It wore what looked like old formal clothing, and it carried a staff that struck the ground in measured taps. With each tap, another line beneath the village went dark, like circuits being cut one by one. Adrian said the figure had to be the one who made the first bargain, the leader who tried to save his people by selling them. He was trapped by the same system he created, but he was still trying to finish what he started, still trying to push the dead onto new bodies. Some kinds of greed do not stop when a person dies, they just lose their mask. The ground began to tremble. Mounds in the square split open, and hands emerged, dry and burned, clawing at the soil as if the earth was refusing to hold them anymore. Bodies pulled themselves upright, clothing reduced to hanging strips, skin darkened and cracked like old wood after a fire. They were not fast and they did not need to be. They moved with the steady patience of something that has been waiting longer than fear lasts. Adrian tried to hold them back with marked paper and a blade he carried for show, and he realized quickly that show does not mean much when the threat is real. Mara looked again through the mirror and she saw thick dark lines attached to the bodies, like chains made from shadow. Every chain led back toward the cracked pillar, toward the source of the bargain. She said the bodies were not acting alone, they were being pulled, like tools dragged by a hand nobody could see. They ran toward a small shrine at the edge of the village, an old structure with warped beams and a stale smell. Inside, the air felt slightly clearer, as if the containment system still had one working hinge. Mara said the shrine was a node, a point where the old seals were strongest, and if it broke, the village would stop being a prison. The pounding on the shrine door came quickly, a heavy rhythm like waves hitting a wall. Shadows pressed against the thin wood, hands scraping, bodies leaning as if they did not feel weight or pain. Noah's breathing turned ragged because he recognized the sound of something outside wanting in, and he understood it was not only the bodies. Behind the altar they found a low door secured by rusted chain. Adrian broke it open with shaking hands, and the stink that rolled out was thick and metallic. A narrow stairway descended into the earth, wet stone underfoot, the kind of space that never fully dries. At the bottom was a chamber carved with symbols similar to the pillar, but deeper, more concentrated, as if this was where the decision had been made. In the center sat a skeleton dressed in decayed formal clothing, eye sockets glowing with a dull red light that looked more like heat than life. Its bony hands clutched a rotting journal, the cover swollen from moisture. Mara opened the journal carefully, turning pages that threatened to crumble. The writing described a leader begging for a way to keep the village alive, then agreeing to an offering that would satisfy the thing beneath them. Later pages described betrayal, the leader refusing to give up his child, murdering the ritualist who arranged the bargain, and trying to trap the hunger underground while the village burned anyway. Adrian said it was not a story of a monster choosing victims, it was a story of people choosing them. The plague may have been real, and the fear certainly was, but the long nightmare began when the village decided survival mattered more than innocence. The journal ended with one word repeated again and again, not like prayer but like a wound pressed open. The skeleton's jaw shifted slightly, and the chamber filled with a dry, rattling laugh. The walls cracked and bony hands pushed out from between stones, grabbing at them with cold strength. Noah screamed, and the sound was swallowed quickly, as if the room did not want to carry human noise. Mara cut her finger and pressed blood onto a marked strip of paper, and the symbol flared pale. The bony hands recoiled from the light, but the room answered with a deeper vibration, like something stirring below. Adrian said the system was hungry because it was built to consume, and it had been starving for a long time. The symbols on the floor brightened to a dark red glow, forming a circular pattern like a drain opening. In the center, a whirl of black smoke and thick shadow began to rotate, and the air grew so cold Noah's teeth clicked. Within that moving darkness, shapes shifted, large enough to suggest something enormous without ever showing it clearly. Noah stumbled back and his eyes fixed on the center as if pulled. Inside the swirl, a familiar figure appeared, not fully solid but unmistakable. It looked like Quinn, pale-eyed and empty-faced, wrapped in dark bands like chains that tightened whenever he moved. Noah's whole body shook and he took a step forward before catching himself. Mara said the people taken by the village were not simply dead, they were held like collateral. She said the bargain had never ended, it had only been paused and the streamers had restarted the payment schedule. Mara reached into the swirl with her marked paper, and one dark band snapped, releasing a thin burst of pale light. A shape slipped free and vanished upward like breath finally exhaled. The skeleton shrieked without lungs and the chamber shook harder because the system did not want to lose what it owned. Adrian told Mara to keep cutting, his voice raw with urgency. He said if they did not break the chains they would join them because the village did not care who fed it, only that it was fed. Noah watched Quinn sink back into the swirl and something in him collapsed, not loudly, just finally. The whirl opened wider, and the darkness inside surged upward like water breaking a dam. A pressure filled the chamber, heavy enough to bend the flame in Mara's palm. The thing rising was not a cinematic monster, it was worse because it felt like a presence built from hunger and memory, something shaped by what the village had paid. Adrian tried to stand between it and the others, raising the tools he had brought, and he realized how small his certainty was. He was knocked back hard, not by a claw but by force like a door slamming. Blood filled his mouth and he tasted iron and embarrassment at the same time. Mara held her mirror up, and the surface caught light that did not seem to come from anywhere. The pressure recoiled slightly, like an animal flinching from a bright sound. Noah saw the skeleton in the center get crushed by the moving darkness, its red glow snuffed out, and he understood even the village leader was only food in the end. Mara told Noah to place his hands on the mirror, and he did it without thinking. Pale shapes gathered around them, faint outlines that felt like released souls drawn toward something clean. The mirror brightened, and the chamber's red symbols began to flicker, struggling between containment and collapse. The pressure surged again and Adrian forced himself upright, using his body like a wedge. He pushed forward with a stubbornness that looked almost pointless, and in that moment it was not performance anymore. He held the line the way people do when they know they will be hurt but choose to be hurt anyway. Mara focused on the mirror, and the pale light intensified until the room's edges looked blurred. The dark pressure shrank back, not defeated with spectacle but restrained like a lid pressed down. The world tightened, pulling inward, and the cold in the room began to loosen as if something had finally been locked back behind a door. When it was over, it did not end with silence, it ended with the sound of dust settling. The red glow in the floor dimmed, the bony hands withdrew into stone, and the air turned stale. Adrian collapsed onto one knee, breathing like he had been underwater, and Noah's hands stayed on the mirror as if letting go would invite everything back. Above them, the village groaned, timbers shifting, earth sighing. Mara led them up the stairs and out through the shrine, and they stepped into a dawn that looked too pale to feel safe. The fog still hung between houses, but it moved more slowly now, like a crowd that had lost interest. They walked through Black Hollow without speaking much. The houses stood the same, but the watching feeling had changed, less active, more withdrawn, like something settling back into sleep. Noah kept glancing toward windows, not expecting faces anymore, but unable to stop himself. At the gate, Mara stopped and looked back once. She did not look for a figure in gray, and she did not look for the pillar, she looked at the village as a whole. Her expression was not victory, it was fatigue, because she knew containment is not the same as cleansing. On the drive down the mountain, Adrian kept his eyes on the road, and Noah kept his eyes on his hands. Nobody celebrated because there was nothing to celebrate. The people taken were still gone, and the village's story was still buried under a century of dirt and silence. Weeks later, the internet kept doing what it does. People begged for the location, asked for coordinates, insisted the whole thing had been staged, and promised they could prove it. A few new channels posted rumors about Black Hollow, offering updated investigations, like the village was an attraction that just needed better lighting. Mara did not respond to any of it. She put the mirror away in a plain wooden box, wrapped it carefully, and locked it like you lock away something that should not be handled casually. Noah deleted what he could from his phone, but he said the images still played behind his eyes when he tried to sleep. Adrian returned to his work, but he stopped filming for a while. He told himself it was recovery, but it was also shame, because he finally understood how easy it is to confuse courage with an audience. The truth is that some places do not need witnesses, and some stories become stronger every time someone tries to monetize them. I heard about all of this later, not from a documentary, not from a podcast, but from someone who knew Noah and watched him fall apart quietly. Noah said the worst part was not the fog, not the jars, not even seeing Quinn in the dark, it was realizing how many people had wanted it to happen. He said the chat had been hungry, and hunger has a way of feeling innocent when it is shared. If you think that sounds unfair, it is worth remembering how the village began. A community got scared, then got greedy for survival, then agreed to a bargain that required other people's lives. They sealed the evidence, buried the bodies, and told themselves it was done. Then generations later, strangers arrived with cameras and called it entertainment. The strangest thing about Black Hollow is not that it is haunted. The strangest thing is how many times people have tried to open it, and how often they tell themselves it will be fine. They say it like a joke, like a challenge, like a plan for the weekend, and they never hear how familiar that confidence sounds. Some nights, when the wind is right, people living near the mountains still hear faint knocking in the distance, 3 taps that come and go with no clear source. They do not call the police and they do not go looking, they just shut their windows and keep their lights on. And when morning comes, they act normal again because pretending is easier than admitting how close a door can be, even when you swear it is locked.